My given name is Virginia, and so I picked out Gini out of Virginia. And now my mom will call me Ginny.
Excellent. Go ahead.
First, I would like to thank the Lavender Library for having us and having the opportunity to come here. This is exciting. I'm nervous, and I'm a little older than you guys, so it's been a while since I've done this type of work. So a little introduction. I came to UCA in 1979, and I was a music major as a freshman. Played in the band, was in the choir, and then figured out about 3 years into it that I was gay, and life fell apart. And so I did not finish a degree here and figured out I didn't want to be a high school band director in Arkansas. Mm-hmm. So I left school and wound up in a IT career at Axiom for 28 and a half years. Got laid off and wound up at another IT job at a public health shop in Little Rock. I've been there 9 years. So when I turned 60, I took advantage of the over 60 waiver here in Arkansas to come back and finish a degree. And that is how I wound up here to present to you my capstone. My concentrations are in American Studies, Social Sciences, and Family and Health Sciences. I think Family and Consumers, they've changed it enough. So anyway, my presentation is about ratifying change. And right up front, my thesis statement is right on the front page. The impact of an Equal Rights Amendment on the LGBTQI plus community in the United States. And I thought it fitting that the preamble of our Constitution is the basis where we start. We the people. And that means everybody, because that's our mantra. We're part of this country, and we are part of we the people. So we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Okay, but that didn't include everybody. And we know that. We've had several amendments to our Constitution that grant or extend rights. Those being 3 of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. After the Civil War, we have the Reconstruction amendments that abolished slavery. Also the 14th that focused on equal protection under the law and granted civil rights to those so that everybody was covered in due process. And then the 15th Amendment, which prohibits the denial of voting rights on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And the 15th Amendment is the first time an amendment to the Constitution includes the word male. So they meant what they said, only the men. The 19th Amendment, of course, came along in 1920 when white women were granted the right to vote. And then the 24th Amendment, many years later, eliminated the poll tax. And then a more recent, to me, amendment in 1971, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, expanding the rights to the younger folk. So in my research, I did a lot of digging into the history of the Equal Rights Amendment. So it's a very simple amendment. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States on any state on account of sex. And the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Alice Paul wrote this amendment actually in 1923, but the women's movement itself grew out of the abolition movement. And interestingly enough, there was a convention on abolition in Europe, and there were women delegates that were there. And the biggest argument of the whole convention was, well, are we going to seat the women, right? And that's what brought on the women's movement in the United States on a bigger scale. You have Seneca Falls, they come together, they write their Declaration of Sentiments, which is kind of like inclusifying the Declaration of Independence. And Alice Paul writes out in 1923, I believe, 1923, or excuse me, 1923, this version of the amendment to get introduced. Now, the 19th Amendment was finally ratified by the states and went into effect in 1920. Alice Paul wanted to keep pushing for the Equal Rights Amendment. The women's suffrage movement was not quite ready to go that far because they had the impression that, well, they have the right to vote. So they don't need to go as far as getting an Equal Rights Amendment because they can vote for what they need. But what they didn't take into account was the fact that even though they had the right to vote, they didn't have the political clout. They didn't have the political gamesmanship to make those things work in their favor. And so, because the majority of them thought they had everything they needed by the right to vote, the ERA movement fell by the wayside. This particular amendment was introduced for the first time in 1923 to the Congress. It was introduced every single congressional gathering of the Congress. Sometimes it didn't make it out of committee. Sometimes it did make it out of committee, but it didn't get a vote. And then in 1972, Congress finally passed it to send it on to the states. But they also, at the same time, put a 7-year deadline on it. And that first deadline was in 1979, which, by the way, I have a story. That was my freshman year here. And somewhere in the archives of the Echo, there is a question about how do you feel about the Equal Rights Amendment? And I can remember being a good little Baptist girl from a small little town in Arkansas. And I said in my response that if women want to go to battle, let them. Or something to that effect. And there you go. So as a reference, in 1979, I was 18, 17, 18. I wasn't really engaged. And it didn't occur to me that I was actually giving away my power by not being engaged. So after they get it to the states in a hurry, they get all kinds of ratifications in the states. But they fall 3 states short. And I don't know if you are familiar, but Phyllis Schlafly and her Stop the ERA campaign and the Eagle Forum, I do want you to know that her daughter is now head of the Eagle Forum and still on the opposition of any kind of equal rights amendment. So even though this particular amendment is where it is today, I can tell you that politically it is still being opposed in whatever form. In 1994, the three-state strategy came to be. Congress had set that 1979 deadline and then extended it to 1982. Well, Phyllis Schlafly, and I believe she even came to Arkansas with her Stop ERA movement. No more states. She was everywhere, in the media, on the news, on the talk shows, on the 3 channels. And it stalled. But in 1994, a group of activists got together and they started thinking, okay, if we could just get 3 more states. So when Nevada turned Democratic right before 2017, they ratified the ERA. And then Illinois and then Virginia in 2020. So I don't know if you've heard the news or if you're following it, but it is currently in legal limbo. And until those particular court cases get through the courts, we kind of have a path, but not really. But that doesn't mean the fight's over. So I want to talk about, just because this particular amendment hasn't been ratified, that doesn't mean that we don't have other means. The first time it was submitted, states started ratifying it left and right. I can tell you that in the Congress today, there are 2 things happening. They're trying to get a resolution passed through the Congress to remove the deadline completely. At the same time, they're starting a new amendment. So if they can't get the old one through, let's start over. So let's think about what those impacts would be if we got an equal rights amendment. So we would have consistent and standards across all the states. We live in a very conservative state, so we feel the immediate impact of what our legislators are doing. But if we had an amendment in the Constitution, that would be a deterrent on passing those kind of laws that discriminate against the LGBTQI plus community. It would also elevate the scrutiny for the court cases and how they apply their court logic and constitutional logic on those laws. And it could mean a reevaluation of current court decisions. So this is why I want to present why we can expand it. We've done this in the past. We look to our history. Lawrence v. Texas overturned Bowers versus Hardwick. Bowers versus Hardwick was case in Georgia, and I believe it was 1982. That case, the Supreme Court ruled that the sodomy laws in the state of Georgia were constitutional. That they could create laws that made it a crime for intimate sexual behavior between members of the same sex. But then Lawrence v. Texas came in and overturned that law completely. It made all sodomy laws across the nation unconstitutional. Brown v. Board of Education. That's where we got separate but equal. It's called the separate but equal doctrine. But then Brown versus Board of Education overturned that and made it unconstitutional. And we have Loving versus Virginia. Interracial marriages were illegal in Virginia, but not across the state line. So Loving v. Virginia made Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924 unconstitutional. These are just a few of the Supreme Court decisions where that changed our understanding of what rights are, what our rights are. And so we have a history. Yeah, it's difficult, but we can look to our history to know that there's hope. And if we did have that amendment, we could expect those impacts. Constitutional rights are not protective per se all by themselves. Mm-hmm. So you have to have laws that contribute to and help enforce those rights. These are just a few of the laws that have granted or extended rights in our country. And I'd like to make a couple of points here in that even though the 15th Amendment was part of the Reconstruction amendments, those laws, that constitutional amendment was not even enforced until the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Mm-hmm. So that's where you had, the Jim Crow laws and poll taxes and things like that to prevent people of color from voting. Even older Americans like me, we have an act that grants several rights in order to protect older people, because nursing homes and assisted living and families who abuse or whatever, those laws are in effect to protect us. Black women in the United States did not officially gain the right to vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then we have the ADA in 1990. And I don't know if you're familiar, but Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act is what is a very, very major piece of legislation that, if the ERA is passed, will be the basis for laws to be re-examined. Because of that section, it prohibits discrimination based on race, ethnicity, language, age, disability, sex, pregnancy, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And that is the law that we want to pay attention to for future legislation and Supreme Court rulings to make sure that we don't lose that right. Okay. The social. What impacts could we expect as presented before? Normalization of acceptance. You start with being okay in public, right? You make you give the laws that make these protections available, and then society starts to fill in back behind. It's kind of a feedback loop where you have a law in place, and the law kind of nudges a lot of people, and so social acceptance follows, and then a little more social acceptance follows, and then a little more laws for protection. Let me see if I skip something. I didn't. Okay. So, some of the things that we should expect as well are less tolerance for public and political shame. We know we get a lot of that here in Arkansas. There should be a reduction in hate crime violence and a rise in grassroots advocacy and civil involvement. We saw that with the bathroom bills, and we saw that with the laws that wanted to eliminate gender affirming care. So my example for you is that we all know this picture, right? This happened in Little Rock. This is public violence against a marginalized person. But behind that, there are still people who were not accepting of the violence the mob was dishing out. And if you don't know the story, Grace Lorch is her name, and she comforted Elizabeth Eckford that day and made sure she was safe, and made sure she got to a bus, and made sure she got home safely. So this is our feedback loop. We have the crowd going after them, but we have the small social group that's like, that's not really the right thing to do. And we have those supporters. Mm-hmm. And here are some reasons why we should expect that social change. Legal recognition and protections lead to greater social acceptance. We know that to be true. We all celebrate it when we can get married. My wife and I have been together 20 years already. We're now together 30 years, but 10 of them legally. There is a commitment, and if you're not familiar, there is a commitment by the government to collect data on sexual orientation and gender identity. And there's trying to find the word. There's a committee out of the White House that is putting together the standards and the possibilities on where to insert places in different agencies on collecting this data so that we understand what's happening with our community. Of course, better legal protections deter hate, public hate, and the youth of today, like you, are blazing the trail. So here's our positive feedback loop. On the topic of intersectionality, everything's connected. We know that everything's connected. We also know that as a marginalized community that we have intersections with pretty much all of the marginalized groups. Race, class, gender identity, gender expression, mental health, physical disability, and many more. So I debated on this slide, but the challenges that we have been there, answered that, we're still getting the same stuff. We're still hearing that women will be drafted and they'll have to go fight in the war. Or who's going to take care of the children? And these are all arguments that Phil Shackley's organization presented, and each and every one has been debunked or laughed at, or and we all understand that legal protections alone are not enough to change our prejudices and the institutions that continue to force prejudices on our community. But the American ideal is about freedom, equality, and justice. It was founded that way, even though they didn't mean women when they said, we the people. And they didn't mean enslaved persons when they said, we the people. And they didn't mean people who were poor and didn't own property when they said we the people. But we are still the people. And it is up to us to civically engage. And even though the current Equal Rights Amendment has not been added to the Constitution, although the majority of people in this country think that it has, it is still upon us to try and make that happen. Questions?
I am always just so cognizant especially at this time of the year, right, of the invisible labor that women carry about, celebrating the holiday season and decorating for the holiday season and buying all of Dad's Christmas presents and right, all of the emotional labor too, right, and making sure that all the family is included. How do you think that the perception certainly of that unpaid and invisible labor changes in a culture when you have codified equality measures in that way?
That's a very good question. One of the articles that I read had to do with equity instead of equality, right? And as we study on a sociological level, gender roles being a social construct, is being reinforced through our capitalistic society. So it's still a matter of protest, in my opinion. Women who continue to accept, oh, this year's color is blue. My gosh, I gotta go buy blue. I gotta paint the dining room. And white is out. I need gray counters, and we're bombarded with that. That capitalistic perpetuation is what continues to keep those gender roles reinforced, right? Oh, I gotta have the latest and greatest style, or these are the women's clothes that so and so is wearing, so I got to go buy those. Until we get, I think it would be a trigger, right? The majority of people in this country already think that the ERA is part of the Constitution. But the wake-up call, and it has happened, for instance, with Dobbs. Dobbs overturned a federal right to abortion. That's bodily autonomy. Well, the people in Ohio went, I don't think so. And went right out and put that initiated act on their ballot and voted it right back on their Constitution. So it's going to take those gripping, oh my God, they did that kind of moments to say, hey, I'm part of this, similar to The Feminine Mystique by Gloria Steinem in the 70s, right? That was a wake-up call when the men were like, women are just off doing their thing. But it got big. It got really big. And we got really close. But then we had another woman come in and really, stir the shit. It takes those moments.
Well, that was fine until, women doing their own thing excluded the men around them.
Oh,
we don't need
exactly.
men in order to enjoy ourselves. And we don't need men for...
Exactly.
Well, now women have joined the workforce, right? And women now have, purchasing power and buying power. And so the marketing has definitely shifted in that way, in ways that I think we will start to see, right, as women gain financial freedom and financial power in other parts of the world. but yet we're still here.
We are still here, but we are making progress. Today, when I was in college, I needed to make a will. In the state of Arkansas, when I was in my 20s, that legal document had to say I was not pregnant. Because if I was pregnant, I couldn't make decisions about anything. Anything. That's not happening today. So we're making progress. Progress is slow. It's not, our immediate satisfaction that we're used to today, scrolling the internet. But we can't forget that we already made some of these steps. So let's go back and build on them. Let's go back and build on them.
I really appreciated that you brought up the Bostock and then is it section 1557? And
1557 of the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah. I think that those are really interesting examples of places in which we could better enforce, right, existing policies with a more complete infrastructure within the Constitution. And I was really struck by this idea that we need this like back and forth, right, between the constitutional amendment and the legal protections. Because I think one of the things you hear a lot now about, for example, the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade is, we just need to make sure that there is a law, because that can take the place of seeing this as a constitutional right? Rather than seeing those as both necessary or as co-equal.
Right.
So I think that that's really interesting, the way that you talked about the necessity of both working together and gave those really clear examples of how that could be reinforced. But I'm wondering, with the simplified language of the Equal Rights Amendment being something that is almost a bigger umbrella than a lot of the other rights amendments, do we run into issues where that gives people too much freedom or flexibility to misinterpret who it applies to? Do we need something that's more specific if we imagine another ERA in order to get that kind of interplay back and forth? Or do we want that flexibility so that we can do other things through the law? Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
And there's a current, another amendment on the horizon that's fairly new. It's called the Equality Amendment. That pulls in not just sex, it calls in pregnant persons and sexual orientation and sexual identity, and it pulls them all in, and it's just laid out.
Yeah.
However, that doesn't mean that we can't build on what the courts have already decided about Title VII.
Yep. And Title IX.
And Title IX, but Title VII specifically for this, but Title VII only applies to education, right? Similar to Section 1557 only applies in the healthcare space under the Affordable Care Act. And those are restricted to institutions that accept money from the government. So even though it's restricted, we still have the wording in those court cases that can give us the ammunition to build better laws until we can get, the amendment with it. Something else I noticed in my research when I was looking back through the amendments and Scalia mentioned this, is that the Constitution doesn't require discrimination against women. But does it protect against it?
Right.
And the answer to that is no. And if you look back on our amendments in the Constitution, the way they were written, they are shall nots instead of we're protected, or this group has these rights. For the most part, especially the later amendments, and in the Reconstruction amendments, definitely. These the states it's telling the states that they can't create laws that discriminate based on these conditions. It's a shall not instead of a these people have these rights.
It's interesting too.
But that's a difference, I think, in protection, right? Seeing the Constitution as a protectionary document versus a, enforcement or enabling tool.
Yeah, the current Constitution, the way it's worded, gives originalist way too much leeway to drag us back instead of carry us forward.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something else I was thinking about in your presentation too, about, why is this conversation important now? What is it going to do for the future, especially since so many people think about it having already passed. When I ask my students though, they don't even know it exists, let alone now.
Exactly.
It passed.
Exactly.
I know.
Because in the media, we're going to get
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah, I
by
asked
the
my
way,
first year student
that
this
this
semester,
state
they're
did
like,
this, but
Yeah. But I'm thinking about, Thomas saying that he wants to go back and revisit, for example, Lawrence v. Texas.
We are in
And he
danger.
wants to go back and revisit Loving, and he wants to go back and revisit, right? But the if there was something like the ERA or an ERA in the way that you put it, it would be much harder to go and revisit those because there would be that constitutional protection. So it just goes back to your point about the need for both of them working together. I also think you answered Carl's question a little bit later because you talked about the what are they calling that, the other version, the equality amendment, just equality amendment. I was like, I can't remember if they added another term, but they're specifically providing parental rights, and that's a way to introduce the idea of these other protections for unpaid care labor.
Yeah.
And you see that happening in other countries that have implemented parental leave policies as being more universal. You get that knock-on effect of there tends to be greater equity in house care. There tends to be greater equity in all of the other unpaid labor you were talking about too. So I think that's a good little key element we should definitely put in there.
Does it have a snowball chance in hell of passing? No, it doesn't. But
Wilford Codrington, his article, "The Benefits of Equity in the Constitutional Quest for Equality," his argument is more to instead of going forward to get equality, his stance was that equity is already within the purview of Congress to create laws that are about equity instead of equality. But he didn't get much traction on that because he gets lost a little bit in the noise.
Yeah.
Because it's a real narrow type thing. But I thought that was real interesting about to pursue it. And then studying it this way, you're like, okay, so we the people doesn't mean we the people. So let's say what we mean, right, going forward. And plan for the future while we're at it.
Well, that's the thing about constitutional amendments,
Yeah.
right? It's really hard
It is.
to pull one of those back. And that makes it really hard to pass one, right? That's why we've only done it 27 times, right?
It should be
In
hard.
200 plus years. But, right, only once have we passed one and then said, oh shit, that was a terrible idea. Let's rethink that, right? Most of those big amendments have just extended or clarified elements, right? Maybe the way that we wanted to elect presidents was a terrible idea. Let's rethink that.
Exactly.
I mean, ultimately, a constitutional amendment is absolutely necessary to sort of codify and put that. I mean, why is it necessary to say that women should be equal to men. But yet we're afraid to
Right.
say it. We're definitely afraid to write it, and certainly afraid to do anything about that.
And many of the scholars are like, we are in no way saying that a man is equal, as in equal, volume, weight, tall, whatever, to a man. We're saying the equity, these things they have privilege and rights to, and we don't. And that's what we're saying. That's another one of those counter arguments.
It is. It's like women and men aren't equal anyway.
Yeah. It's not that we're not equal. We're different, but we're human.
Until they're 9. Yes.
I was curious what you think about the division within like the LGBTQ community, how that plays a role in not just ERA but further protection rights, because partially probably due to social media and such, we get to hear more opinions, but it's not uncommon to hear someone say, I'm queer, but I'm not that kind of queer, and those sorts of things. How do you think that will play into future laws and protections?
Let me think on that a second. I can tell you that I remember we were involved in the Conway Occupy movement, and there was a person who later came out. She was all for marriage equality, but she's like, these other things are more important, similar to in your presentation. But when you look at where the women's movement came from, it came out of abolition. And if you look at that example, and we are so much stronger when we're together than when we're isolated into silos. I can remember thinking, okay, I'm gay. I'm a lesbian. But I don't know what this trans thing is. And what do you mean Q? And what the hell is I? And damn it, where did A come from? Right? So as we become a solidified community, our fortunes are tied together. And the intersectionality of both LGBTQIA plus ... whatever that winds up being. Some are calling it now sexually diverse. There's another letter. It's forgive me for forgiving. We are all tied together.
SDI, yeah.
And just like in the civil rights movement, white and black were tied together. It's not that we as whites could liberate, the civil rights activists, but by gosh, we can support them and we can do our part, even though in the LGBTQ world population, I'm not too keen on drag shows anymore. I'm an old lady and I don't want to do that. I'm not into it, but that doesn't mean that I can't support them. And if we come together and really, really solidify as intersected, those small little pieces will all come together. It's hard. In the 70s and 80s, we had to do this in private, right? We're like, I can tell you that one of the ways that you found another gay person on this campus was to go to a library and see who checked out the book. But you don't have to. You have social media. Thankfully, you have web. And you have Prism. Oh my God, that would have been, that would have been scandalous in the 80s. But small steps, reaching out, bringing them in, and solidifying the community You may not all believe the same thing. You may not all want the same things. Like the civil rights movement, there were a lot in the civil rights movement that didn't want all the same thing. You had the Black Panthers. You had Malcolm X. You had Martin Luther King. They didn't all necessarily want the same thing, but they knew they had to come together. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Gini, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
So politics aren't my area, and so this might be not an intelligent question. But do you think that since the fact that we have marriage equality was an executive order, and we don't currently have the ERA, do you think that if the ERA were not to pass in the near future, do you think that marriage equality could return to being a states' rights issue?
I think that we're under threat of that happening if the current court gets a case that they can even drag a line.
Yeah.
Because they did that in dogs.
Yeah.
They took the most convoluted, misogynistic,
Yeah.
British opinion to make their argument instead of basing it on precedent and on American legal standards. So yes, as long as this Supreme Court is in office, is in their position, we are under threat. Any of those things that we have gone, especially they decided marriage equality based on okay, y'all help me. Based on the 14th Amendment.
Mhm.
That we all have the protection of the equal rights under the law. Right?
Yep. Here to affirm. Yeah.
Yeah, here too. So, because his argument was because that right wasn't granted
Right.
there, that they want to go back and look at all of them.
Yeah.
And that's part of that originalist,
Yeah.
federalist society mentality that it wasn't the original intent of the law, which for them that's how that's their doctrine. They're saying the original intent of the law wasn't that, so you can't apply it. But that's why you create the law. That's why you build on the law. That's why you add as the country changes, as the society changes. And we're in a political gridlock that has set them in a place where they could threaten a lot of the rights that we currently enjoy. I believe, like the people of Ohio, that would be another tipping point.
Yeah.
That a lot of people would go, this is stupid. This is this is insane. This is not what our country should be about. But according to politics, though, you don't have to really pay attention to the politics of it, per se, as in the news. But if you pay attention to the court cases that are coming out of the Supreme Court, you're gonna be able to ignore all the fluff and drama that's coming out of the news media and the political parties. That's my story. I'm sticking to it.
I think that's right.
Thank you for the question. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much.